This is part 3 of the Liam Fee case. In part 2, we covered the remaining weeks of the trial, including the prosecution and defence's closing statements, before ending with the jury retiring to deliberate. Did you think about what questions or points you would be raising if you were part of this jury? Would there be any doubts in your mind about Naomi and Rachel's guilt to every charge they faced? Let's pick up on Friday the 27th of May 2016. The jury had begun their deliberations on late Friday morning, following Judge Lord Burns having gone through the options available to the 15 jurors in terms of the charges Naomi and Rachel faced. However, by late afternoon, they still had not reached a verdict, and so the case was adjourned until the Monday morning. The 15 jurors returned to Livingston High Court on the Monday. However, following 4 hours of deliberation, one of the male jurors complained of feeling unwell, and so the court was again adjourned until Tuesday morning, with it being decided that the ill male juror would be unable to return to deliberations. So at 10 a.m. on Tuesday the 31st of May, the remaining 14 jurors, 8 women and 6 men, returned once again to begin their deliberations. 2 hours later, after a total of 10 hours of deliberation, the jurors reached a verdict. 29-year-old Naomi Fee and 31-year-old Rachel Trelfer, or Fee, were both found guilty by a majority on all 8 charges they faced, including murdering their son, 2.5-year-old Liam Fee, after subjecting him and 2 7-year-old boys to a catalogue of horrendous abuse and neglect, spanning over a period of more than 2 years, and of failing to get Liam medical attention for his broken leg and fractured arm in the days leading to his death. They were also found guilty of attempting to defeat the ends of justice after Liam died by not only hiding evidence, but by also trying to blame Liam's death on one of the young boys staying with them. According to an article in the BBC News, as the verdicts were read, Naomi looked impassively straight ahead. Rachel looked nervous and chewed on her lips, and Liam's dad, Joseph, was in tears, with the prosecutor later saying outside the court that it is impossible to express in words the sense of loss that Joseph feels on the loss of Liam. Naomi and Rachel were then led away, with their sentencing set to take place on the 6th of July, following background reports and risk assessments being carried out, as well as it having to be decided which of the women's prisons in Scotland they should serve their sentences at. Before leaving the court, the jury were told that they would not have to serve on a jury again for 10 years. The jury then gathered their belongings, said bye, and left the court to carry on with their lives. After 7 weeks of hearing the most atrocious acts of abuse towards children, after at least having each other to share their thoughts with, now they were alone. They couldn't discuss what happened during those 10 hours of deliberation ever again. We will hear later from the jury member who took ill during deliberations and how the trial impacted him, but how it also impacted him no longer being part of the jury. But first, there was a flurry of articles following the trial. People could now express their opinions and thoughts on what had taken place at the trial, and how a 2.5-year-old child and 2 7-year-olds had been left, abandoned, to some absolutely shocking abuse, despite multiple concerns being raised. First to speak outside of the court following the verdict was Detective Inspector Rory Hamilton, who led the investigation into Liam's death. He was quick to praise the bravery of the 2 7-year-old boys who had been in the care of Naomi and Rachel for the evidence they had been able to provide, of the horrendous abuse they and Liam had suffered through the interviews they gave that led to the 2 women being convicted of Liam's murder, and that, without the evidence of the boys, it clearly would have been very, very difficult to have got this case to court. It was following these interviews that Naomi and Rachel had swiftly moved from witnesses to suspects, and ultimately being detained and charged in August 2014, after initially being released in April 2014, while further inquiries were carried out. The DI went on to say that it quickly became clear that all the issues and problems were after Rachel and Naomi got together, that there had been a significant change in Liam's treatment after Rachel left Liam's dad and their home in Gateshead, England, and moved to Scotland with Naomi. He went on to say that what emerged from Naomi and Rachel being interviewed and the following investigation was that the couple had been very, very close, and that Liam had become somewhat of an inconvenience, going on to say that Naomi would certainly appear to be quite a dominating part of the relationship, and a close friend of Rachel's family said that Rachel's relationship with Naomi was toxic. D.I. Hamilton also advised that while police from Gateshead in England had dealings with the pair in relation to previous convictions for minor offences, he said that since they had moved to Fife, as far as he was aware, there had been no police involvement with the pair. He ended by saying that despite the absolute hell the two young boys had endured over a sustained period of time, they had both been placed in foster care and were now thriving, going to school and doing really well, with it again being reiterated that the two young boys' welfare had been paramount. It was later reported in an article in the BBC News that the foster carer for the young boy who Naomi and Rachel had accused of killing Liam said he was an amazing young man, kind, thoughtful and generous, and that he had responded to normal activities such as going to the park and soft play, so a bit different to the violent sexual predator that Naomi and Rachel claimed he was. When Detective Superintendent Gary Cunningham from the Major Investigation Team was asked outside of the court if he felt there had been failings from the police when a police officer had accompanied a social worker to Liam's home in 2013, he said, "That's not really for us to comment on. From a Major Investigation Team stance, we got brought in following the death of a child." He went on to say that while it is upsetting and horrific when on very rare occasions these types of cases do happen, I think everyone in the community has a focus and should have a focus on child protection, raising any reports when they think children are at risk. Although, in Liam's case, many people were focused on reporting their concerns, but sadly this just wasn't enough. It was also revealed in The Scotsman that months before the trial began, Naomi and Rachel had returned to live in a small village in Gateshead, England, following their arrest. However, this stay had been brief, as they had been forced from their home by angry residents. Upon finding out that the newest residents of the village, Naomi and Rachel, had been accused of murdering their child, a protest was arranged, where residents gathered outside their home and shouted abuse at the pair and threw eggs at their home, with it being reported that a police helicopter and dog handlers were called as the disturbance continued into the evening. Naomi's former best friend Sean, who had also taken to the stand in defence of her, said in an article in the BBC News after the verdict that, "I didn't think in a million years she was capable of any of that stuff, especially towards a baby." Another former friend of Naomi and Rachel was said to say that no sentence for the pair could ever be long enough for the crimes they had committed. Gillian, who had been close with Naomi and Rachel but had fallen out with them and wasn't around when Liam had died, went on to say that they're going to be in jail for some time and they don't even deserve a place in prison because they're still going to get everything paid for them and they're still going to get every day of their lives. She said that she had been unaware that there had been any problems and was shocked to have looked out of her window and saw the ambulance outside Naomi and Rachel's home the day Liam died and the pair out in the street shouting, "Help." "I was shocked, totally shocked when everything happened." She added that she didn't believe that social services could have done any more to have helped Liam and the two young boys who had been in Naomi and Rachel's care. Naomi's mum Janice also spoke out in the Daily Mail, with the headline reading, "My daughter didn't murder the bairn." Janice had attended part of the trial and said she was really annoyed because much of the evidence was misreported, going on to say that it's horrendous, absolutely horrendous, especially because of the things I know and the things that aren't being printed. She continued by saying that she knew every single thing that happened the night Liam had died, and "I know that the jury are seeing these things, and I know that they're not getting into the paper. It's frustrating." She ended by saying that, "We know the truth, but no one will print the truth, so what's the point in speaking to people?" And that's all she would say. Whatever the truth was, for whatever reason, she wasn't going to be telling the Daily Mail or any other newspaper, as nothing else was reported. So I'm not really sure what she was alluding to. I do know from my sister being on the jury, though, that not everything that happens in court does get reported or reported accurately. It was also announced that a significant case review would be taking place, which would be chaired by a retired paediatrician and child protection specialist, with the aim of the review being, according to the Vice Chair of Fife Child Protection Committee, Douglas Dunlop, to determine what services had been involved in Liam's case prior to his death, which will give us a picture of any lessons which can be learned, with Douglas Dunlop going on to say that I know it was said in court that there was a break in contact from a specific team in relation to Liam and other services continuing to be involved with him during that time, but this is a sort of issue that will be examined in some detail through the significant case review. However, a Fife councillor was reported to have been shocked and disturbed that Liam had been allowed to drop off the radar when his social worker had gone off sick, saying, "If someone goes off sick, someone else needs to pick up on all the cases. Cases need to be flagged up as priorities," going on to say that they will have some difficult questions to answer during this significant case review. However, the manager of the Scottish Association of Social Workers felt that the problems such as bureaucracy and resources had to be addressed, saying that the main issue is that people still spend 80% of their time writing reports or doing paperwork, and only 20% of actual social work time engaging with children and families. While the Children First chief executive said that in her mind there should be no doubt that the responsibility for Liam's death lies with his mother and her partner, and that until the results of the significant case review were available, we don't know if differences in the child protection system could have saved Liam, but that questions needed to be asked of Fife Council and its social work department, the NHS, Police Scotland, and other agencies, all of whom are represented by the Fife Child Protection Committee. While a significant case review into Liam's death was welcomed, what wasn't welcomed was, according to an article in the Scotsman on the 31st of May, a campaign group who were opposed to the Scottish Government's plans to introduce a named person for every child, especially in the wake of Liam's death, with them saying that Liam's case raised more questions about the scheme. Apparently, in 2009, Fife had been the first region in Scotland to have begun implementing an initiative where all children would have access to a named person from when they were born to when they turned 18, who would provide them with support and advice, such as a teacher or health visitor. This scheme was due to be rolled out across Scotland at the end of August 2016 and had been said by the government to have been working well. Some were critical of this initiative, though, feeling that the initiative was invasive and would detract from targeted interventions. A spokesperson from the group, No to Named Persons, said that despite the Scottish Government's insistence that the pilot scheme was working well, the death of Liam, in an area where the named person scheme was in place, told a very different story, with the spokesperson adding that the public is entitled to ask if Liam Fee was not only a victim of his mother and her partner, but whether this scheme got in the way of the kind of targeted intervention we all wished had been used to save his life. Various Scottish Government members were quick to jump to the Named Person Initiative's defence, though, with one member of the Scottish Parliament saying that it is deeply distasteful for any campaign group to politicise the tragic murder of a young child. The only people responsible for the death of Liam Fee are those convicted of his murder. Another Scottish Government spokesperson said that, clearly the individuals responsible for the unlawful death of any child are the people convicted by the courts. And the Scottish Conservative Shadow Justice Secretary said that while there is no legislation that could prevent the kind of abuse that Liam Fee suffered, it is clear that we can't stand back and do nothing, especially as Liam's case had been allowed to fall off the radar, despite many significant concerns being raised, and that this had raised serious concerns about the system and the checks and balances that take place. A Fife Council spokesperson said that they welcomed the results of the significant case review and would consider any recommendations that emerge. And the chief executive of the Care Inspectorate said that all agencies who were involved with Liam must now establish if there was any action that might have been taken that could have led to a different outcome for him, and that, if there are lessons to be learned, they must be directed at preventing future tragedy. Despite the Named Person Initiative being piloted in Fife, Liam Fee had not been allocated a named person. Do you think him having one would have made a difference? Or do you think the scheme itself reduced resources that may have picked up on the abuse? While it was intended for the named person scheme to have been rolled out throughout Scotland, following debates and panels, issues were raised about the information sharing plans for the scheme, which would have breached rights to privacy under the European Convention of Human Rights, which then led to new legislation which was amended to resolve many of these issues. However, this also failed, as since the process had started, data protection laws had changed significantly, making even this new legislation impossible to implement. By the end of 2017, the named person scheme for every child would no longer happen. What was also talked about in the newspapers following the trial was how what had happened to Liam and the two young boys had affected people, with the head of the National Society for the Protection of Cruelty to Children, Scotland, saying that everyone who had followed this case will have been deeply affected by the accounts of neglect, cruelty and violence inflicted on Liam during his short and tragic life, and that it had, rightly, shocked the public. And Assistant Chief Constable Graham, who was the lead officer for major crime and public protection, said in an article in the Herald on the 31st of May that the death of a child is always traumatic, but the murder of a child has a terrible and lasting impact on the family, on the wider community, and on the carers and professionals involved. And a manager of the Scottish Association of Social Workers said that there is only so much you can take. Part of the concerns that we have currently in the UK as we're talking about 8 years maximum in the life of a child protection social worker. Many people leave the profession because they can't cope with this anymore, because it's relentless. And it's something that you don't think about. Ambulance crew and police officers who are first on the scene, and social workers, they're all human, and of course the death of a child is going to affect them. And there's also those who are one step removed from this case. For example, reporters and jurors. How could this case have affected them? Well, one reporter who attended the trial said that despite reporters being viewed as being ruthless and insensitive, she said that after each day following the 2 weeks where the two young boys' recorded interviews were played, she would go home to her son, who was around the same age as the two young boys, and see the sharp contrast between the horrendous abuse they had suffered compared to her own son's cheery chat and being unencumbered by any worldly concerns. She said that despite being one step removed as a reporter, the abuse that came out of the trial was upsetting, with some information not even being able to be reported. Now, what about the jury members? Yes, they were told they wouldn't have to serve on a jury again for 10 years, but what support did they receive after the trial? The jury member who'd become ill during deliberations, Alan Tate, spoke out about his experience in an article in the BBC News on the 4th of July 2016. He said that when he arrived on the first day of the trial, he knew it was going to be a high-profile case, as there were photographers and TV cameras outside, all of which initially was exciting for Alan. That was until the 5 pages of charges were read out, and by the end of the trial, he wished he could forget everything he had heard, saying that he still experiences flashbacks and has woken up at night and been in tears. Alan found it testing at times, being a jury member, especially as he had a daughter who was 6 months older than Liam. Alan said he gets triggered from everyday things, such as cable ties, which were used to tie Liam and the two young boys' hands and feet. Seeing cable ties takes him back to the courtroom, back to hearing that part of the evidence, and he finds this very traumatic. Also burned into Alan's mind is the picture of Liam lying dead on his bedroom floor, and he has dreams about being in a cage. On being asked about becoming ill and no longer able to take part in the trial, he said, "It was really hard. I'd been with other members of the jury, and suddenly I was outside, all by myself." He said he felt very alone, and not being able to tell anyone what had happened was one of the toughest points for Alan. While over time Alan does believe the memories will fade, he said he does not believe that the trauma of the evidence will ever leave him. Alan said that he hadn't been offered counselling, which is something that is up to the presiding judge of a trial if they offer this or not, and he's not sure if he'll seek it out. Had Alan been showing signs of distress, or if the judge had decided to open up counselling to the whole jury, then they would be referred to the designated counselling service, run by NHS Lothian in Edinburgh, where clinical psychologists, psychiatrists, cognitive behavioural therapists, and even art therapists treat adults who have experienced traumatic stress. Do you think you would have sought out this help had you been part of this jury? One thing that QC Derek Ogg felt could make it slightly easier on jurors was for cases to be risk assessed, and, if deemed appropriate, jurors should be warned about any potential graphic evidence involved in a trial. As at the moment, while the public are excluded from hearing exceptionally horrendous and graphic details of a trial, the jury have to listen to everything and are given no warning when it's going to happen. A trigger warning for a trial may just help a jury member prepare for what they are about to hear. Following the trial and debates about who was to blame for what happened to Liam and the two 7-year-old boys, the results of the significant case review were revealed, which included 20 recommendations, including mandatory child protection training for GPs and any children with injuries of concern to be examined by a paediatrician. The review also highlighted that there had been little evidence of professional curiosity when it came to staff accepting the explanations of Liam's injuries, despite the fact that there were many statements that contradicted these explanations, which in turn led to a de-escalation of concerns. This was aided by the lack of further robust inquiries being made about Liam's weight loss, with child abuse and neglect not even being considered as a cause. There was also the disguised compliance by Naomi and Rachel of accepting help offered by professionals only to then continually cancel or rearrange appointments, which apparently allayed any suspicions from social workers but should have instead raised suspicions. The report discovered that many things were likely missed due to social workers passing information on rather than considering it themselves, meaning each event was dealt with in isolation and the bigger picture being missed. The comments around the named person scheme, which was still in place at the time of the report's publication, were that it was not fully understood by professionals. The report concluded that while there were missed opportunities across services which could have potentially prevented the harm Liam suffered, ultimately his murder could not have been predicted or prevented, as Naomi and Rachel were manipulative, devious, and hindered services. Following the release of the report, many of the organisations involved released statements saying that they deeply regretted that their services didn't do more to support Liam, and that better information sharing would have helped gain an overall picture and could have helped coordinate support for Liam. Social Work Scotland Vice President Jackie Irvin said, "The fact that the report states Liam's death could not have been predicted does not mean we have nothing to learn, and that the report findings and recommendations would be carefully considered and explored to help ensure it is understood how to improve things." There were, however, consequences to come to a particular individual who it was felt had severely failed Liam, which they did not agree with. But first, on the 6th of July, Naomi and Rachel were at the High Court in Edinburgh to receive their sentences. Before sentencing, Judge Lord Burns told the pair they had grossly abused their parental responsibilities and had shown no remorse for the cruel regime of neglect and ill treatment towards Liam and the two other boys in their care. The judge then sentenced both 29-year-old Naomi Fee and 31-year-old Rachel Trelfer to a life sentence, with Naomi to spend a minimum of 24 years in prison and Rachel to spend a minimum of 23.5 years in prison before being eligible for parole. Both women were said to have displayed little emotion as their sentences were read out, before being led away to begin their sentences. Outside the court, Naomi's defence QC said, according to an article in the BBC News on the 6th of July 2016, that Naomi had accepted responsibility for the unforgivable neglect on Liam, but still continued to maintain she was innocent of his murder. Rachel's defence QC, however, said that Rachel believed there had been a miscarriage of justice, that Rachel had been locked up in a different prison to Naomi, and since the trial she had been practically locked up for 24 hours a day in her cell, including meal times, for her own safety, other than a 5-minute phone call in an evening when the rest of the wing is locked down. Her defence counsel stated that while people may think that she deserves nothing less, he went on to say that this cannot be a long-term solution for someone who is going to receive a very lengthy punishment period. He went on to say that Rachel is basically alone and would serve her sentence alone, with no family visiting her or writing to her, as they had disowned her, and her only communication being from Naomi. The prosecutor kept it simple, though, by saying that Rachel and Naomi were guilty of unyielding, heartless cruelty. So Naomi and Rachel had been given their sentences. The two 7-year-old boys were thriving and in loving foster homes, and the significant case review had been carried out and recommendations had been given and hopefully were being implemented. But as I mentioned previously, the blame game wasn't to end there, as there were consequences for a particular individual, Leslie Bates. The social worker who was accompanied to Liam's home in January 2013 with a police officer, but no further action was taken at this point in regards to Liam's welfare, as Leslie and the police officer believed in Naomi and Rachel's explanations for Liam's injuries. It was reported in the national newspaper in September 2016 that over 3 years prior, in 2013, Leslie Bates was made the subject of a disciplinary investigation, moved to a different team, and reported by her employer, Fife Council, to the Scottish Social Services Council, and a misconduct hearing finally took place in September 2016, with Leslie facing 12 charges against her over failings that amounted to neglect of children in her caseload over the period from December 2011 to August 2014, including a failure to record a number of visits, assess risk, and refer cases to other support teams. Leslie denied all of these charges, chose not to appear at the hearing, and had since relinquished her role as a social worker. The hearing panel were told by Leslie's former bosses and colleagues that a lengthy investigation into Leslie's work had taken place before she was moved to a different department, with the investigation deciding that Leslie should be given an opportunity to continue practicing, but should be moved to a different team. During the misconduct hearing, it was reported that Leslie was disorganised and chaotic, that she showed no regard for vulnerable people, failed to carry out risk assessments, and had not kept clear and accurate records. It was also said that Leslie's work was poor and that there had been serious questions about her assessment of risk following Liam's death, and that she was probably the most erratic person I have worked with. She was fine when there was no work, but the minute anything was required, she failed to undertake it. She didn't understand risk, and I had a real concern about her visiting families. I constantly tidied up for her because I wanted the children to be safe. The panel also found Leslie's boss at Fife Council, Karen Pedder, who had taken to the stand at Liam's murder trial, and other social workers to be defensive and evasive when giving evidence at the hearing, being deemed to be less reliable than might reasonably have been expected. Following the hearing, the SSSC reviewed all of the evidence and information presented to them before deciding if sanctions should be imposed and what they should be. Leslie was found guilty of all the charges she faced, including serious misconduct in the case of Liam Fee and 14 other vulnerable children, and it was determined that Leslie Bates should be removed from the register of social workers, although systemic failures at Fife Council were also found to be partly to blame for the pattern of misconduct that developed. Fife Council were quick to reassure the community that the practice highlighted in this case is historic in nature and was dealt with robustly, and that this case does not reflect our current practices or the high standard of professionalism which we expect and receive from our social work staff. So this might seem clear-cut, and that the right decision was made, but nearly a year later, Leslie would tell her side of the story in a BBC Scotland documentary, where she claimed that she had been made a scapegoat. Things seemed to quieten down for a month or so after this, until November 2016, when it was revealed that Rachel Trelfer had been given permission by the Court of Criminal Appeal to appeal against her murder conviction, claiming that the judge at the trial had misdirected the jury regarding legal requirements needed to secure a murder conviction against Rachel, and that he had not properly explained to the jury about the lesser charge of culpable homicide, and that because of this Rachel's conviction was unsafe. The appeal hearing took place in February 2017, where Rachel's defence advocate laid out their reasons for believing Rachel had suffered a miscarriage of justice, including the fact that evidence presented by the Crown at the original trial showed strongly that it had been Naomi who had been the main actor in Liam's murder, and that the jury should have been entitled to convict the appellant of something less than murder. The prosecutor, Alex Prentice, told those present at the appeal that Rachel had done nothing to alleviate or stop what was happening to Liam, and so therefore the jury were entitled to convict her of murder, and that there is no room for culpable homicide in this case. Just over a month later, Rachel's appeal against her conviction was rejected, as there was no basis upon which it could be said that the appellant did anything less than actively associate herself with a common criminal purpose, which included the taking of a human life. Since that time, it appears that Rachel has since accepted her conviction, or at least she hasn't been granted an appeal again. Naomi never did appeal against her conviction. Again, Liam's tragic murder faded into the background, with all loose ends seemingly tied up, and hopefully changes being made and lessons being learnt. That was until August 2017, when a BBC documentary called Fife's Child Killings, The Untold Story was broadcast, where Leslie Bate claimed, "I don't think the blame lies with me," believing she had been made a scapegoat. Leslie Bate spoke in the documentary, giving her side of the story for the first time. She explained that while her department had received calls in January and February 2013 from Heather Farmer, Liam's childminder, raising concerns about injuries to Liam, at the same time Leslie was having a breakdown and struggling to cope with her workload and job pressures. Admitting that due to this, she had failed to properly follow up these concerns about Liam, saying, "I know I made mistakes, but I was falling apart. I shouldn't have been at work. I was just losing control." Leslie, however, carried on in her social work role until April 2013, when she went off sick. Leslie feels that while she was off sick, her bosses tried to find gaps in her record keeping and any other errors she had made in order to serve her with disciplinary action in September 2013. While looking into Leslie's timekeeping and work issues, at that point, surely having been made aware of what cases Leslie had been working on and had had to abandon due to being off sick, Liam's case still was not picked up by anyone while Leslie was off sick and obviously unable to work on the case. If they had really been looking closely into mistakes that were being made by Leslie, why would Liam's case not have been given to another social worker at that point, when Liam still had 6 months left to live? It would appear that Leslie was not the only one making mistakes. While Leslie is very sad that Liam Fee died in such horrible circumstances, and to have had any part in that, it's a horrible feeling, she doesn't think the blame should lie with her, or indeed entirely with social workers. Going on to say that, at the end of the day, the parents killed that child. Someone should have been visiting them, taking over where I left off. There were opportunities that must have been missed. She feels that it is unfair that no one else from Fife Council has faced disciplinary action over the failings in Liam's case, saying, "All the blame seems to have been put on me and nobody else has been held accountable. It was easy to scapegoat me because I'd left. Saves blaming somebody that's still there doing a job." Fife Council Chief Executive said that every effort is made to support staff in their jobs, and the council works hard to help those who are experiencing difficulties. This case does not reflect the high standard of professionalism which we expect and receive from our social work staff. A link has been made with this worker and the death of Liam Fee through the media, not by the council. Going on to say that, while there was some brief contact with Liam, we can confirm that this worker was not involved with Liam in the period leading up to his death. Leslie did eventually return to work, but following the disciplinary hearing, she had been moved to another team, but due to ill health, ultimately left her job 2 months later. Her last involvement with Liam or his case was in April 2013. Liam died on the 22nd of March 2014. So at this point, in August 2017, following hearing from Leslie Bates in the BBC documentary, it would appear that she was the last social worker to see Liam alive, albeit almost a year before he died. But a mere 2 months after the documentary was broadcast, new information was disclosed by another BBC investigation which proved this was not the case. For this new investigation by the BBC, former Fife Council social worker Barbara Barnes was interviewed and said a few weeks before Liam died, she'd received a phone call from Victoria Hospital in Kirkcaldy in Fife, saying that a family being 2 women and a baby in a buggy had visited the hospital, but that the child in the buggy had had a blanket over his head, and the 2 women had refused point blank to let the child be examined, which made the staff at the hospital suspicious, and so they phoned social services for them to follow this up, the child being Liam Fee. Barbara was unable to do this herself as she didn't cover the area where Liam lived, and so she asked another social worker from the area to arrange a visit. Upon Liam Fee being found dead and Barbara hearing about this, she decided to check up what had happened with this referral, noting from the system that a duty worker had attended the property to check on Liam. But upon being told by the two women that Liam was in his bedroom and was unable to be disturbed due to his autism and him becoming distressed and upset at seeing a strange man, the social worker left and no further action was taken. Liam died 3 weeks later. This was most definitely another missed opportunity. But what was even more worrying was that this visit was not mentioned at all in the significant case review report that was carried out following Liam's death, with Barbara saying that, due to this, the report is not a true reflection of the situation that led up to Liam's death. Though while it won't bring back Liam, it might make a difference for the next child, if it was recorded. When this was brought to the attention of the Scottish Government, an independent investigation into this was called for, with a spokesperson going on to say that this is not about blame. This is about trying to understand why these things happen again and again, and why when you look at our serious case reviews, you see the same issues flowing through each one. While Fife Council's Child Protection Committee refused to comment, the chairman of the Fife Chief Officers Public Safety Groups said that some details were not included in the published significant case review report to protect the privacy of others involved, which remained the case. Going on to say, it's important to point out that the case was not closed at the time of Liam's death, and that all matters pertaining to Liam were fully considered by the independent lead reviewer in coming to our conclusion, which included reading all case files and interviewing staff who were involved in the case. What do you think? Do you think it was important for all information to have been disclosed in the significant case review? Do you think the fact a social worker had visited Liam's home weeks before his death and that no action was taken should have been disclosed? Do you think that Leslie Bates was a scapegoat? You might have noticed that the BBC Scotland documentary was titled Fife's Child Killings, The Untold Story, and that a Scottish Government spokesperson alluded to there being other cases like Liam's that had happened previously when he said, "This is about trying to understand why these things happen again and again." That was because there were other cases. According to an article in the BBC News on the 5th of August 2017, in the first 4 months of 2014, 3 young children had died in Fife at the hands of those who should have been protecting them. In January, 3-year-old Michael Cooler was beaten to death by his mother. In March, 4.5-year-old Liam Fee was killed by his mum and her partner. And in April, 2-year-old Madison Horn was attacked and killed by her mother's new boyfriend. A significant case review was also carried out following Michael Cooler's murder, with 13 actions being identified for learning and implementation. According to an article in the BBC News on the 2nd of August 2017, the manager of the Scottish Association believed that there had been significant improvements following these 3 deaths, going on to say that social workers in Fife feel they are working now in a better environment than maybe had been the case before. I really hope that things have improved since then and lessons have been learned following these tragic deaths of children in Fife. It was reported in Edinburgh Live on the 13th of January 2021 that Naomi had got engaged on Christmas Day to a fellow murderer who also was serving her sentence with Naomi at Greenock Prison. Apparently Naomi doesn't have many friends, is not popular with her fellow prisoners, and they are sickened by the pair, as they don't hide their relationship and are always groping each other and sneaking off when they can. It's not clear whether Naomi had divorced her civil partner Rachel Trelfer, who was serving her sentence at another prison. That's the end of the episode. If you're in the UK and have any concerns about a child, you can call the NSPCC helpline on 0808 800 5000. Thanks for listening to another episode of Scottish Murders, the twice award shortlisted fortnightly podcast that brings to light the stories of victims and their relentless pursuit for justice. If this case has captivated you, then don't forget to tell a friend to listen or check out scottishmurders.com so together we can share more Scottish Murders. Until next time, I've been your host, Dawn.
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurin Ton.